Okonjo-Iweala, and thank you for being with us tonight. You are our number 2 disruptor tonight, as you are trying to shake up the global trading system and also using your platform to push for vaccine equity. We were originally supposed to discuss the ministerial conference, which was supposed to happen last week, but got cancelled because of the pandemic. With the ministerial pushed back, the members have not yet agreed on a new date. What does this delay mean for the World Trade Organization, and especially as it's already going through troubled waters?
Well, I think that having to postpone the ministerial was a very tough decision and unfortunate in the sense that we had been working so hard. Ambassadors had been negotiating, everybody was trying to really get results at the ministerial. And unfortunately, we were caught in this Omicron war, if you want to call it that, and we had to postpone. As I've told many, it took us a couple of days just to recalibrate, but what we are doing now is that we're back at work, pushing the negotiations. So we've been working hard all week. We'll be working hard next week. I think the holidays will come in. And when we come back, we'll continue. I've just sent out a letter today. We've been putting a deadline of end February to get the results on both fisheries and a response to the pandemic. So yes, it's disappointing that we had to postpone, but that doesn't stop the work.
Okay, and this new deadline that you've said, it obviously helps to put pressure on negotiations, but don't you also need the political pressure and the gathering of ministers to make sure that decisions are taken on these negotiations that are have been going rather difficult on several topics?
Yeah, it's true that you get somewhere in the negotiations where really political decisions are needed. But it also, and this is why ministers convene, but that model I've also urged in the letter I sent out, we have to revamp it because we just do not know the trajectory of this pandemic. We don't know what countries are going to do with travel restrictions and quarantine and things like that. So we have to change the way we do business. So what we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors, use this holiday time to really sit with the ambassadors, discuss the issues and give them the political power to come back and negotiate and clean out the brackets that were there. That's what we're asking. And, we have modern means of communications. If a delegation here feels that they really need to talk to their minister, well, we have the means to connect them so that they can have that talk and then get back to the negotiations. In the meantime, we'll be watching to see what happens with the pandemic and the new variant and that situation. If, for instance, it gets better and there's a chance to have a ministerial, we will sound the membership to see if they're willing. So it's not that I've ruled it out, but we certainly do not want to be held hostage to it. So we want to continue the work. And if we finish, we can use virtual means to bring ministers in. We've done a virtual meeting before and it worked. It wasn't really a decision-making one, so we'd have to devise means for them to be able to make a decision, but it's not impossible.
Okay, and before the ministerial got cancelled, just a couple of days before, it was still unclear what, if anything, would have come out of the meeting. Part of that, especially seen from a Brussels point of view, was seen as a lack of engagement from the US administration. Do you have any hopes that this might change in the coming months, especially as Joe Biden's nominee to the WTO could be confirmed in the near future? Will this unblock the situation, for example, with the appellate body, the WTO highest dispute court?
Well, let me take this issue. I disagree somewhat with the view that the US was not engaged. The US has been engaging on various issues. They've engaged on the issue of fisheries. They've been very active. They've engaged in other negotiations. They've been there in agriculture. In the response to the pandemic, they were there, and in the outcome document. You can say perhaps the level of engagement differs from one issue to the other, but they've most definitely been engaged. And we've been able to talk to Catherine Tai. Now, on the issue of dispute settlement, you're absolutely right that the US has had problems with this for quite some time. And they were not ready really to say how they wanted to get the reforms to the system done. So that's correct. But what has happened is getting towards the ministerial. They were willing and able to agree that we should put together a process at the ministerial that would lead us towards a reform of this system. So that I think that's the only area where they felt they were not ready to really lay out how they wanted to see the dispute settlement system reformed. And of course, you know that this is quote unquote what people call the jewel in the crown of the WTO. And so everyone is quite anxious to see that system reform. But we at least got to the stage where we were working on language that ministers could agree to that would set us on a path towards reform of the dispute settlement system.
Okay, I'd like to move on to the issue of vaccine equity, because I know it's very close to your heart as a former chair of the Vaccine Alliance, Gavi. You mentioned the February deadline earlier. Is this one of the issues that you want negotiated solution on, either a trade and health declaration or even the more sensitive issue of waiving patents for COVID-19 vaccines, which until now WTO members have not been able to agree on?
Yes, I absolutely feel that having a response to the pandemic on the trade side is very, very important, because we've been able to demonstrate that trade can be part of the solution and WTO can be part of the solution to this pandemic. That's why I think a response is important, not only on issues of intellectual property and waiving intellectual property, but also on issues of export restrictions and prohibitions, because this is what impinges on supply chains working really well. Also on issues of really working with manufacturers on the granular bottlenecks that they face. We've been able to do that successfully. And if you go to our website, you'll see studies published of what we've been doing with them that has led to us to help them to be able to increase production. Remember that production has had to be tripled worldwide, where we were producing 5 billion doses of vaccines totally before the pandemic. We now need 15 billion, 12 billion to 15 billion. And we've been able to work with them to up that. So response to the pandemic consists of several parts, consists of this issue of lowering and making sure we don't have export restrictions and prohibitions, and that we work on trade facilitation measures so that inputs from medical countermeasures and outputs can flow freely. You have the area of working with manufacturers to try and ease their bottlenecks and work with them to invest in emerging markets and developing countries so that they can manufacture vaccines and other things. And the third part is transfer of technology and intellectual property waiver. And so that part, I think, that's where we were having difficulties of members coming together. It's been over a year that almost 100 developing country members asked for the waiver. Now, what we're trying to do now is not let the pressure off. I hope that by end of February, we will indeed have an answer to the intellectual property issue, so that we can have a package, if you will, on all across this spectrum that I spelled out, which would be a response to the pandemic, not only to this pandemic, but also spelling out what we would do if there's a future pandemic, so we don't have to revisit all these issues.
Yeah, you previously urged countries to drop the all or nothing approach in these negotiations. Was that a message that was also directed to the EU, which does not want to waive intellectual property rights?
It was directed at everybody, because the WTO is a negotiating forum. So we can't have you can't come and say, give me this or else, or I won't do that or else, because then nobody will get anything if we have such a polarized situation. So it's really directed at all the parties who are trying to negotiate this issue, that if we have an all or nothing attitude, we'll all walk away with nothing. And I still maintain that. So the effort right now is to bring everyone to the table, to find a compromise solution that will be satisfactory to all parties involved. And we think that there are landing zones that could be reached on this particular issue.
And can you give an indication of where do you think this landing zone might be, as you are very well aware of all the different positions around the negotiating table?
I can't, unfortunately. I mean, I'm not a member. I'm not negotiating, so I can't preempt what members will say. I'm just indicating that it doesn't have to be all or nothing. Okay. That we can get to a package. You know, nobody will ever get 100% of what they want when you are in the negotiations, but they will get a satisfactory solution to the problems that we're envisaging. All those who wanted to make sure they have access to intellectual property or to technology transfer to be able to make the vaccines and other medical goods. I think we would be able to find a way, as well as then give reassurance to those who think this will lead to innovation being blocked or research not being incentivized. I really think if all parties are willing to come to the table, that we could find some landing zones.
Okay, maybe one final question on the issue of vaccine equity. As you mentioned, export restrictions. As the head of the World Trade Organization, with the Omicron variant now troubling the world, how worried are you about the impact on the global economy?
I'm quite worried. I'm really worried. I think having this Omicron variant has definitely put a damper, will put a damper on the recovery. You know, we're on our way to a fairly robust but uneven recovery. And that uneven recovery was based on two things. You know, the access to fiscal stimulus and monetary easing in the richer countries, or if you want to put it the other way, the lack of fiscal space in the poorer countries to be able to implement fiscal stimulus, and then access to vaccines. Both the IMF in their work and ourselves at the WTO in looking at trade and the factors in the recovery of trade, it found that these two issues are definitely the biggest determinants of which countries are recovering robustly and those who are not. So we have this divergent and uneven recovery because of access to vaccines. So that is why I've said that vaccine inequity is just not acceptable. We've seen this Omicron variant, and I think if we don't work really hard to solve this problem, we will continue to have these difficulties, which at the end of the day, they're going to really pose a huge downside risk to a sustainable economic recovery for the world.
Okay, so all the more need to find a solution by the deadline that you have set today, if I understand correctly. Let me address one final subject, if I may. We later tonight have an interview with Frans Timmermans, the Commission's Executive Vice President, who is in charge of the European Green Deal. You have been critical on the EU's plans for a carbon border levy. What is your message to him, to our European audience on these plans?
Well, I don't know if you characterize what I've said as being critical of the EU's plans. What I've been critical of is the fragmented approach worldwide to the issue of carbon taxes or carbon pricing. A system in which you have 68 to 69 different carbon taxing or pricing regimes is one that is very difficult for those who are trading to navigate, for businesses to navigate, for countries that are poorer to understand. So what I've been advocating is that instead of this fragmented system, we move towards a methodology that can lead us to a global carbon price. So on the one hand, you can say that, look, countries that are coming up, or even jurisdictions within countries coming up with approaches to carbon prices, kudos to them for trying to think of a way to incentivize a low carbon development pathway. But if you look at it from a global point of view, this fragmentation is somewhat problematic. That is what I'm talking about. And I think it would be easier if we worked towards a global carbon price. So, and we have to be careful that in trying to do these things, the poorer members, the developing country members at the WTO, who are quite concerned that some of these approaches to carbon pricing or taxation will end up as protectionist measures against them, or cause some kind of disincentive to their exports. We have to be sure that their views are also taken into account in any approach that we take. This is very important for trade. Otherwise, we'll have trade frictions, which will end up at the WTO. And we want to be ahead, not behind the curve in dealing with these issues.
And so in that sense, because you know that the EU is also working with the United States on a Green Steel Alliance, which would include certain things on carbon pricing, the arrangement would be open to other countries who would like to join. Is that then maybe a better approach, or is your plea willing to have this discussion within the framework of the WTO with the entire world, or almost the entire world, present at the table?
I think it would be better to have it within the framework of the WTO. And I hasten to say that right now there's the IMF, the OECD, and ourselves are starting to cooperate to think of a methodology that could be acceptable and would take into account the issues that are put on the table. So I think that work, we should pursue it and see if it will lead us to a global approach that will be much more acceptable. Whatever is done with respect to the price, to the steel issue, green steel and so on, we would very much hope that it will be done within the context of WTO rules, so that we don't have a situation in which we have, again, trade frictions. And people bringing cases to the WTO.
Okay, it sounds like a lot of work on your plate. I want to thank you again for being with us tonight, and we hope to see you soon again here in Brussels live. Thank you again, and now I give the floor back to Josh.
Thank you.